one, two, three, four, about 5 to 6 pages. It's a very short preface. And it's actually not, so the book begins with this small introduction, and then it begins with a formal muqaddimah, and then the chapters. So this is not even the muqaddimah, this is even before the muqaddimah where Shaykh Shah Waliullah rahimahullah ta'ala discusses some ideas and some of the reasons he wrote this book. So it's a very interesting and very important introduction. So we're going to read this and just to analyze some of the ideas from this particular preface. And I think that's more useful than if I were to sit here and just talk about Shah Waliullah's book chapter by chapter. Inshallah, maybe we'll do that next week. So Bismillah. So to begin with, okay. If you don't see the slides, I can't really see. I think they're working. Does it say, okay. So if you see any potential problem, just raise your hand and let me know. So we're going to begin with this preface. Now, the book itself is hard to find, Hujjatullah al-Baligha. It's not in print because it's a very old book, 200 years plus. So I have it in PDF. I don't have the hard copy of this book. We have an English translation of parts of this book here. So we sent in the workbook that I sent to everyone includes PDF of at least the chapter we're reading, and I think I put the introduction and this preface in there too, in Urdu and in Arabic. So I'm not sure what pages they are, but you don't need to follow along today, just pay attention so you're not too distracted, but later on you can look at that particular portion, inshallah. So Bismillah, the first thing our Imam Shah Waliullah rahimahullah ta'ala says, he begins with Alhamdulillah. So every book, you can see in our tradition, every book always begins with hamd, with praising Allah Azza wa Jal. So, and then with the hamd, usually the scholars who are brilliant, who have something to offer, within that hamd they add like their ideas, and they add like some of their thinking and their skills. And so there's a brief paragraph that shows you some of the a glimpse into the thought of Shah Waliullah. So he says in Arabic it's very profound, in English you have to kind of think about the meanings. He says, Alhamdulillahi alladhi fatara al-anam ala millati al-islami wal-ihtida wa jabbalahum ala al-millati al-hanifiyyati samhati sahlati al-bayda. So overall you can see that Shah Waliullah, his language is very eloquent, and especially in Arabic. In Arabic, if you read his work, it's a marvel. It's a extreme eloquence. He has perfect command over Arabic, and his descriptions and the vocabulary he uses, even many Arabs, they would have to look in dictionaries, and their level is not that high. So just from hearing the way he wrote, I'll read you just the first sentence, and it's a sentence of 4 or 5 lines. If you translate it, comes out to 2 or 3 paragraphs. So he says, Alhamdulillahi alladhi fatara al-anam ala millati al-islami wal-ihtida wa jabbalahum ala al-millati al-hanifiyyati samhati sahlati al-bayda thumma innahum ghashiyahum al-jahl ووقعوا أسفل سافلين أدركهم الشقاء فرحمهم ولطف بهم وبعث إليهم الأنبياء ليخرجهم بهم من الظلمات إلى النور ومن المضيق إلى الفضاء وجعل طاعته منوطة بطاعتهم فيا للفقر والعلا. That's the first sentence. So what does he say in that first sentence? So what I'm going to do here is just break down idea by idea. We're not going to read line by line, that's going to be very extensive, but we'll break down the entire preface, just idea by idea what he's talking about. So number 1, as I mentioned, is very important to begin by praising Allah. Number 2, so now he presents within this praise, within this hamd, this first paragraph, his overall idea, his vision, his overarching narrative. Okay? So that's why if you look up any older books in Sirah and Fiqh and Aqidah, the introduction or the Muqaddamah is very important because it gives you an idea into the scholar's thinking and his own introduction, and generally in that opening the scholar gives some idea about what this work or a flavor of what this work is going to be. So Shah Waliullah, as I mentioned, just thinking of all the ideas I told you, he looks at the bigger picture, he's able to bring so many different disciplines together. So he begins this work with a story, a narrative. So he says basically in this narrative, he says, الذي فطر الأنام على ملة الإسلام والاهتداء. So he begins with the human race. So he says Allah is, praise Allah for creating the human race. So now he's bringing this whole book back to all of humanity. It's a very broad book. And then he says على ملة الإسلام والاهتداء وجبلهم على الملة الحنيفية السمحة السهلة البيضاء. So he says, Alhamdulillah, Allah created the human race with this predisposition. Jabbalahu means a predisposition for what? For guidance, for Islam, for this al-millat al-hanifiyyah samha, this nation of tawheed, of obeying Allah Azza wa Jal. So the first thing he says, Alhamdulillah, Allah created human beings, and He created human beings with this propensity for guidance in Islam. So Islam is not just another religion that came in historical progression, but it's the original religion. So you can see he's tying all of the history of humanity together. And then he said, ثُمَّ إِنَّ غَشِيَهُمُ الْجَهْلِ. Then the next idea, he says, after Allah created human beings with guidance, then darkness set in. ثُمَّ غَشِيَهُمُ الْجَهْلِ. Guidance and ignorance set in. With various ways, Allah created Adam, and then after the generations, slowly darkness began to spread in. And then he says, وَوَقَعُوا أَسْفَلَ السَّافِلِينَ. And some of them, the human beings who created with guidance from day one, some of them fell to the lowest ranks. وَأَدْرَكَهُمُ الشِّقَاقُ. And they became very unlucky. And then Allah stepped in, He said, فَرَحِمَهُمْ وَلَطِفَ بِهِمْ وَبَعَثَ إِلَيْهِمُ الْأَنْبِيَاءَ. Then Allah, out of His mercy, Allah didn't want to leave human beings after He gave them guidance to begin with. Then human beings lost that guidance over time. Then Allah continued to have mercy on human beings. So then He sent to them prophets, Anbiya. So that's part of the same idea. So the mercy of Allah. And then what is the purpose of these Anbiya? لِيُخْرِجَهُمْ بِهِمْ مِنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. To bring human beings back from the darkness back into the light. So this is the whole cycle of humanity. This is the Quranic narrative. So the Anbiya came. And then he says, just to fast forward, he says, ثُمَّ وَفَقَ مَنْ شَاءَ مِنْ أَتْبَاعِهِمْ لِتَحَمَّلْ عُلُومِهِمْ. Then Allah blessed followers. So not only you have Anbiya, the prophets, but Allah blessed many among human beings to follow in their footsteps. And then he says that He created when He sent the prophets, He sent them to be obeyed. So He gave them a way to follow the religion. And then you have these followers who follow in the footsteps of the prophets. And He says these followers, they uncovered asrar shara'ihim. They uncovered the secrets of the Sharia. So this is an idea, just keep in mind, Shah Waliullah will refer to secrets a lot. This is a terminology he uses a lot, asrar. And you can see as we progress how that factors into Hujjatullah al-Baligha. So then you have followers, and these followers discover, by following the Prophet, the secrets of religion. فَأَصْبَحُوا بِنِعْمَةِ اللَّهِ حَائِزِينَ بِأَصْلِ أَسْرَارِهِمْ. And then they become back to that original state of guidance, and then they ascend to the Malakut. And then he begins by saying, then he ends this whole paragraph by saying, and among these followers of the prophets is the Prophet Muhammad, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So this is the whole story he begins his opening with. This is the narrative. Allah created human beings with full guidance. Then they eventually lost the way. Allah continued to have mercy on them, sent Anbiya and prophets. And then these prophets had great followers who were able to discover the ways of following the religion and the secrets. And the greatest of them, he ends by saying, is Sayyidina Muhammad al-Mu'ayyid bil-ayat al-wadiha al-gharra. And then he sends salat and taslim on the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And then he says, Amma Ba'd. When you see in an Arabic book, Amma Ba'd, that means now the book begins. So there's always, before that period of Amma Ba'd, that's where the scholars, they praise Allah, and they begin with salat and hamd and thana and tahmeed and so on and so forth. So this is the beginning, like the first paragraph. So just from that first paragraph, you can learn all these things. How Shah Waliullah is thinking, how he likes to bring everything back to like the whole story, the bigger picture. Okay? Any questions so far? So again, after every few points, I'll do a quick analysis. So from this, you can see the holistic vision of Shah Waliullah that I was referring to. He's always looking for the bigger picture. So this book is about something else, but he's tying it in with that bigger picture. And that's generally his style. He's always going to be doing that in this particular work. So moving forward, after he says, Amma Ba'd. So what does he say? Then he says some words about hadith. That's the first thing he says. So he says, Inna umdat al-ulum. So Amma Ba'd, first he says, فَيَقُولُ الْعَبْدُ الْفَقِيرِ إِلَى رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ الْكَرِيمِ أَحْمَدْ الْمَدْعُو بِوَلِيِّ اللَّهِ ibn Abd al-Rahim. So he says his name. He says, so generally a lot of Arabic books that begin with فَيَقُول, the word which means where you introduce yourself. So he introduces himself as the needful slave of Allah, Abd al-Faqir, and his name is Ahmad, and also known as Waliullah. So he puts that, and the son of Abd al-Rahim. So this is how he begins. Amma Ba'd, this book is from the following person. And then he begins his ideas. So the first idea he says is very, very insightful. He says, إِنَّ عُمْدَةَ الْعُلُومِ الْيَقِينِيَّةَ وَرَأْسَهَا. He says, the basis or the base, umda, of all the sciences of certainty. So ulum al-yaqiniyya refers to all the sciences, hadith, fiqh, and even aqidah, and then he puts philosophy and things like that in there. So all the sciences that lead to knowledge, lead to some degree of certainty, umdatul ulum wa ra'suha, and their head. And then he also says the foundation of all the religious sciences, wa mabni al-funun ad-diniyya wa asasiha. And the foundation of all the religious sciences, what is it? He says, huwa ilm al-hadith. So the first idea he's telling us is that ilm al-hadith, the knowledge of hadith, is the foundation of everything. So he's giving you the importance of the knowledge of hadith. So this book, among the topics, is a book of hadith. It's a book of looking at the secrets of sharia and hadith. So that's very important because the book has theology, as I mentioned, it has philosophy, it has sociology, it has fiqh. But from his perspective, he's approaching it as not a book of hadith, which would be a listing of hadith, but just how to understand this whole idea and the whole genre of hadith. So, and then he continues to praise in this long paragraph. He says, فَهِيَ مَصَابِيحُ الدُّجَى. He's referring to the hadith of the Prophet, that these are lamps in the dark night. مَصَابِيحُ الدُّجَى. And then he says, وَمَعَالِمِ الْهُدَى. And these are signs of guidance. So he begins to praise hadith again and again and again. And he says, it's like al-Badr al-Munir. It's like the radiant full moon. Like the full moon was out yesterday, where it's currently in that season. So that when you see the full moon and how radiant it is, how bright it is, this is his comparison or similitude with hadith. So the opening, he's beginning to tell us that the most important foundation is hadith. And why? Because he says, so then he says after that, before he says why, he makes an important point. He said, فَقَدْ, he said, مَنْ إِنْقَادَ لَهَا وَوَعَى فَقَدْ رَشَدَ وَاهْتَدَى وَأُوتِيَ الْخَيْرَ الْكَثِيرِ. He says, whoever recognizes the hadith, follows them, then he is guided, and he is rashad, he is upright, and he has been given abundant good. وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ وَتَوَلَّى فَقَدْ غَوِيَ وَهَوَى. And whoever turns away from hadith, again we're still talking about hadith, whoever turns away, he's misfortunate, he's misguided, and he's in a state of loss. وَمَا زَادَ نَفْسَهُ إِلَّا تَخْسِيرٍ. He has nothing for himself except takhsir, or loss. Okay? And then he says why, and he gives this idea. So he says it very eloquently. He says because. Why? Because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam naha wa amar wa anzar wa bashar wa darab al-amthal wa dhakar. So he says the Prophet, he commanded, he forbade, he gave good news, he gave warnings, he gave similitudes, and he reminded people. وَإِنَّهَا لَمِثْلُ الْقُرْآنِ أَوْ أَكْثَرُ. And what he gave us in terms of hadith is as much as the Quran or even more. So this is the idea, the hadith is as extensive as the Quran. So this is the next thing that he tells us. And this is actually based on hadith. So all the ideas, if you look at the language of the ideas, they're coming from hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is a hadith, it's from Abu Dawood, where the Prophet said, it's a longer hadith, but just he took this portion of that hadith. The Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إِنَّهَا لَمِثْلُ الْقُرْآنِ أَوْ أَكْثَرُ. Verily it, and the Prophet is referring to his own commands, what he tells his companions to do, yani the hadith, his commandments. He says it's just like the Quran or even more than that, meaning So the Prophet was speaking to an idea. Some people were, even in his time, had the inclinations of, today you have the Quran, only people. So there were some people that would ask the question, is it in the Quran? So the Prophet said, I warn you, I guide you, I command you, I forbid you, and what I give you is as extensive as the Quran, is like the Quran, or even more than the Quran in terms of volume. So in other words, the Prophet ﷺ, he's part of the Sharia. So the Quran and Sunnah are both full sources for us as Muslims. So we can't say this is in the Quran, it's not or it's not in the Quran, it's only in the Hadith. If a Hadith is proven from the Prophet ﷺ, his job was to explain the Quran to us. And his job was to tell us what's haram, what's halal. So this is Shah Waliullah's point, that the Prophet, his role is as almost equivalent to the Quran, because he was here to explain the Quran. So this is a great summary of the Prophet's work. He forbade, he commanded, he warned, he brought glad tidings, and he coined similitudes, amthal, and he dhakar. He reminded people of Allah Azza wa Jal. So this is the opening when it comes to hadith. Any questions so far? Okay, so we're at point number 6. We have about 14 or 15 points, I believe. So still continuing with his look at hadith. Now, so an analysis. So you can see his great respect for hadith. So this is really unique in India. As I mentioned, in India before Shah Waliullah's time, hadith was not so popular, and it's something that you always put last. So people would study fiqh, people would study kalam and aqidah and philosophy and mathematics, geography. All this was part of religious learning and language and Farsi. But hadith was often put to the last, and most people never reached there. But you can see Shah Waliullah, after he made the Hajj, he discovered hadith, and just the 2 years or less than 2 years he spent there, it gave him such a different outlook. When he came back, this is the kind of writing he was engaged in. So he had a very profound respect for the importance of hadith. And that's something very unique. And he brought that to the table in India. And after his time, most people now, they have a respect for hadith in the Sunni tradition. And it was not so prior to him so much. Now, the next point he makes a very profound point about the layers in the discipline of hadith. So he says in his eloquent way, he says, verily, so the study of hadith has tabaqat, has layers. And he said some of them are outer shells and some of them are inner shells. And he said some of them are like the shells and inside is a seed. And some of the layers are like oysters and inside is a pearl, like a jewel. So he used very eloquent language to give the idea that hadith study is very various levels. Outer, and there's successive inner levels. So he's trying to give a hierarchy for us when it comes to the study of hadith. And he identifies 4 different layers. So 4 layers of hadith study. So first the idea that there's outer, inner, and then more inner branches. So the outer layers is the more superficial layer. So the first outer layer, he says, إِنَّ أَقْرَبَ الْقُشُورِ إِلَى الظَّاهِرِ. The closest to zahir, what's apparent, is معرفة الأحاديث صحة وضعفا واستفاضة وغرابة. Basically what he's saying is the first level of hadith study, the outer level, is a study of what's authentic and what's not. Which hadith is widely narrated, which is not so widely narrated. So in other words, my summary here is hadith terminology and classification. So, this hadith sahih, is it da'if, is it hasan, is it mashhur? So now that's very interesting. So this is the first level, and then the other levels are deeper. They need more knowledge and they need to uncover more. So in today's time, generally we think hadith is very easy, and the last level of hadith is to find out whether it's sahih or da'if. So we look at it from the flip side today. But Shah Waliullah is very brilliant, and for him, that's the starting point. That's the first level, that's the easiest level for him. The other levels are harder and harder. So the starting point is to say sahih, hasan, da'if. So that's where the study begins. Okay, that's the outer layer. Very interesting how he saw that. And the second layer, he said, is he says ma'ani gharibiha wa dabti mushkiliha. So he said, what he's using the term is that understanding the meanings of the difficult words in the hadith and what they really mean. So in other words, the meanings of hadith. So now the fahm, the understanding the meanings of what the hadith is telling you. That's the deeper layer. So the first layer is just the classification. So anyone can do that, but that doesn't mean you understand the hadith. So now the deeper layer is to understand really what the hadith is saying and the intricacies and all the difficult language. And he says, certain people, like the people of adab and the people of language, they understand this sometimes very well. Now the third layer, so that's first layer, second layer. The third layer, he says, is fan ma'anihi shar'iyya wa istinbat al-ahkam. It's basically application. So now the third layer is looking at what the hadith tells you in terms of the sharia, in terms of haram and halal, yani the application. What that hadith means to you in your daily life, how it applies to the ahkam al-shar'iyya. And he goes on and on describing that to some length. So this is application. So you can say the summary is application. And now there's a fourth layer. What's the fourth layer? And before he says the fourth layer, he says, أدق الفنون الحديثية بأسرها عندي وأعمقها وأرفعها منارا وأولى العلوم. He says, the deepest layer, the most virtuous layer, the highest layer, the layer that's full of the most light, for him, and he goes on, he says, huwa ilm asrar-ud-din, is the knowledge of the secrets of religion. So this is, you can say, is wisdom and rationale. And he refers to it as ilm asrar-ud-din, the knowledge of the secrets of the deen, the secrets of religion. So this is like a deeper level of study, where for him it means tying all the verses of Quran with the hadith, and tying them with the purposes, the masalih, the purposes behind the wisdom. Sometimes you say, what's the wisdom behind this? So understanding that insight, that wisdom, the rationale, the secrets behind prayer, the secrets behind fasting, the secrets behind why we make dua right to left, things like that. So this is the deepest level of study, and for him it's the most virtuous. And he calls it ilm asrar-ud-din. And that's the purpose of this book, Hujjatullah al-Baligha, to discover some of the secrets of religion. So it's a very interesting way of looking at hadith. And he says finally about this deepest layer. He says the benefits of arriving at this deepest layer, or some things about this deepest layer, he says it gives you insight into what Allah commanded. So, and he makes some interesting points. I'll read you from the translation. He says, somebody can tell you, so he says, somebody can tell you that poison is bad for you, right? Someone gives you some poison, and he says this is bad for you, it's going to harm you. You might believe him, but suppose you're a chemist. Imagine you have a biology background, you have a chemistry background. This is the example he uses. And you know what's in it. You know the chemical property, you know it's filled with hydrochloric acid and things like that. So you have a deeper knowledge of what's in it. So when someone tells you this is bad for you, your knowledge is much deeper. It's a deeper insight. So he says that's what this layer does with the secrets of religion. You know what the Quran says is true, but really understanding that it's a different level of engagement. And he says it's a deep faith. It leads to a deep faith on the basis of clear evidence. And here, you can, everything that he's saying, you can tie back to some verse that he's getting it from. There's a verse, Ala basiratin min Rabbi. I follow the clear evidences of my Lord. So basira is that deep insight. Basira is not just knowledge, but a deeper insight. So he says this is what this level engages or brings you to. And he says at the end of the day, it's very rare. This level, most scholars don't reach this level. And he says very few, qalla ma fi. He says very few are those who are able to write or who have written works on this particular level. Okay. So this is a very, very brilliant way of looking at hadith that even is missed by many today. If you could just reflect over the layers of hadith study, hadith terminology, then the meanings of hadith, then their applications, and then there's even a deeper layer of the wisdom and the rationale behind that. So that's something really, really needed, especially in our times today. So an analysis of this, you can see he has a brilliant grasp of hadith sciences. So you can see all the different types of hadith disciplines within the subject of hadith. And again, you can see his holistic vision in putting it all together. So that's so far where we've done 2 pages. So this is just the opening idea. We did the opening and now his initial ideas about hadith. Any questions or comments? Yes.
This is like very mesmerizing and eye-opening as far as from the hadith perspective from a student who studied for less than 2 years and came up with these understandings. Is this something common, or just because it was special of Shah Waliullah that he has the perspective of taking hadith and breaking it down in a way, because as a student of hadith over there, studying all his life and maybe different vision?
Yeah, that's a deep question. I mean, it's just conjecture at the end of the day, but our analysis, most likely what it is you have to understand, he didn't, those 2 years is not where he learned all of this. So he had a whole lifetime before that where he grasped all the sciences. And then when he reached to the Hijaz, the hadith arrived in his mind and he discovered hadith at the right moment in his life. So the hadith was something that triggered everything that he had already learned, and he's able to tie it all together with the hadith. So his discovery of hadith doesn't mean he was learning for the first time there. I mean, obviously you can't be a scholar and teach in the seminar without having some measure of hadith. And also, not only hadith, but Arabic he was already fluent, Persian he was fluent, fiqh he was fluent in fiqh, he knew at least the Hanafi maslak and everything, aqidah. So he had studied all the sciences, but what was missing was a deep insight into hadith. When he discovered that, he was able to filter that in and bring it to what he already knew. And then he had some, his mind was very brilliant. Allah blesses different people with different capacities. So he's able to, just in a short period of time, really analyze things. And just think about how many books do we have that claim to teach you the secrets of the Sharia, or the secrets or the wisdom behind rulings. That's very rare. There's only a handful of books in our entire history. So he was brilliant, he had some capabilities that he was born with, and he had the lifetime of learning, and then the discovery of hadith at the right period in his life. That's the way I see his particular life. Allah Ta'ala Alam. And he says at the end of the chapter, at the end of the day, knowledge is something that Allah opens the hearts. فَمَنْ يَشْرَحْ صَدْرَهُ لِلْإِسْلَامِ. At the end of the day is Allah who opens hearts. Allah creates the intellect and He opens the hearts to just come at the right understanding at the right time. And at the end of the day, that's what happened in his case. Wallahu a'lam.
Okay. Can you give an example of a secret of religion? It's kind of like a negative term.
Okay, so by secret he means, this is a good question. Secret, he means like, so he would mean, for instance, why do we pray 5 times? Things like that. So just an example, I was going to do this next week, but I'll give you a brief. So the idea just gives you a brilliant insight into him. Just to take a fiqhi masala, right? Like praying with your shoes. Just think about that idea, praying with your shoes. Generally, we're ingrained to take our shoes off, right? So, what's the ruling on that? Like, is our salah or our namaz valid with our shoes on? So there's a range of opinions on that, but generally coming from India, coming from our background, shoes are considered disrespectful. So it's a sign of respect to take your shoes off, right? So you can't imagine praying with your shoes, many of us. But Shah Waliullah, there's this very interesting chapter where he talks about the clothing, issues of clothing in prayer. And the way he analyzes that issue, he says basically, because the thing is, there's a hadith on that. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, "Khalif al-Yahud," be different from the Jews. The Jews never prayed with their shoes. So, "Sallu fi na'alikum," pray with your shoes on. So the Prophet commanded his followers to pray with their shoes on. This is one hadith out of many. So, but somehow that didn't reach our tradition and our culture, or even if it did reach, they have a different way of understanding it. But Shah Waliullah, he tied that in such a brilliant, he says, and he tied it with the Jewish tradition. And he said, to analyze the secret beyond, he says, the first issue is, from the Jewish faith, it was a sign of disrespect to have your shoes on in front of elders. And that's why when Musa went to the valley of Tuwa, what's the verse in the Quran? Ikhla'na alayk, take your shoes off, because Allah was speaking to him. But that was Bani Israel, so that's one perspective. That's also a good perspective. It's a sign of disrespect to be in sacred ground and have your shoes on. But that was Bani Israel. Now, Shah Waliullah, he has to deal with that idea, the Quranic verse, and this culture we have. But you have this clear hadith. The hadith is, be different from the Jews and pray with your shoes on. And then it's proven that the Prophet used to pray with his shoes on every time he was outside. And even in Masjid al-Nabawi. People will not believe that, but there were no carpets in the time of the Prophet. It was mud. So they would pray with their shoes on, their sandals on. And the Prophet prayed with his shoes on. There's a famous hadith, and he took them off during one salah. And then all the companions took them all. He asked them, why did you take your shoes off? They said, we saw you do that. He said, Jibreel told me there was some, filth or najas on my shoes. That's why I took them off. But you don't have to unless you're short. So, so this is the idea. So how do you reconcile that with that? So Shah Waliullah, he says this. He says, basically what's different between us and animals. So he brings it to such a deeper level. He says, animals, one of the things that distinguishes human beings from animals is clothing. So we cover ourselves. So atihim. So he says, when you cover yourself in the perfect way, part of the proper covering is your shoes. Now imagine you go to a job interview without shoes on, right? So can you imagine that this kind of perspective? Imagine going in certain situations with your shoes off is considered disrespectful. Because Shawwal is able to understand both sides of this issue. And he says because of that, and because there's a deeper issue here, the Prophet needed to distinguish himself and our community from the Jews. So he commanded us to be different, to pray with our shoes on, because it's the completion of our dress, our libas. Because there's a verse in the Quran, خُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مَسْجِدٍ. When you're praying, take your adornments. And what's adornments? Adornments are those extra things you put on. Your clothes, sometimes the hat you wear, the perfume you put on, all those extra things. And the shoes complete that uniform. Without the shoes, something is missing. So he was able to look at it from that perspective. With the shoes, it completes this uniform and this completion. So this is understanding the secret of the hadith. Without that, you could just look at, it's only about being different from the Jews. The Prophet said, pray in your shoes. Maybe you're speaking to someone that were outside. And so this is a deeper way of looking at things. That's what we mean by understanding the deeper insights. And there are many examples filled in this book. Okay, so let's move on a little bit and then we'll continue taking questions. So then, now he comes, after explaining this, he comes to something a little more problematic or something that's slightly controversial. So he shares a mystical vision of his. So he says basically, let me find the right page. بينما أنا جالس ذات يوم بعد صلاة العصر. So he shares like a mystical vision he had. So mystical visions are something that's very common in people who are influenced by tasawwuf and people who follow, this particular branch of Islam. And in India it was very popular. You can't read any books of our elders without reading these stories of dreams and ilham and kashf and things like that. So Shah Waliullah, coming from that tradition, he wasn't immune from that. So he shares a story or dream. He says, one day he was sitting after Asr prayer, and the person or the ruh of the Prophet ﷺ appeared to him. And he basically put something over him. So like a cloth or a cloak. And he says, suddenly I felt light going into my heart. And suddenly my heart opened up and I began to understand things. So this is a vision he had, the Prophet appearing to him after one of the prayers. And he's sitting in contemplation. And he puts a cloak around him and then this light enters his heart. And he said, after that, I started understanding things. So this question you asked, for him, the answer would be, it was opened up for him, like he had this mystical vision. So, and then he continues. So he said then later on, either sometime later or around that time, he said later on I had a dream. And in the dream, so this was a waking vision. So this is a vision while he's awake. And then the dream he had, he said Hassan and Hussein, radiallahu anhuma, they came to him in his dream and they gave him a pen. And they said to him, this is the pen of our grandfather and we want you to write with it. And then, he took the pen and he said, after that point I began to write and the pen became easy for me and I began to see clearly many, many things. So this is a vision he repeats in this particular book and other books. So, the scholars have some difficulty understanding this part of what he wrote. Every person is a human being, not everything everyone writes is correct or incorrect. So this is, some say perhaps he was influenced by the culture of his time, and this is one of the things in India, to write a book, you have to have this kind of, even today, I know, even today there's an idea among the older generations, like, if you bring to them any scholar or any idea, they don't care. They said, first tell us about who this person is. Did he have any ilham, any kashf? Does he have any dreams? Is he righteous? Is he someone who's pious? So this was very important in India at that time, and it still is. So he was part of that, and he utilized that. Now, it's one of the blemishes of the book, otherwise a very brilliant intellectual book. But when you start bringing like dreams and things like that into it, then it kind of diminishes at least in many eyes, because, you know, this is something, had he kept him to himself, it would have been far better. Our Shaykh Akram Nadwi says the same thing. There's one of those things, you know, had he kept it to himself, he had this vision, you know, it's something you should keep between yourself, and it's not something that adds any value to a book, but it actually diminishes it in many eyes. So it's something you can debate. You know, everyone can have an opinion about that, but you can debate that. So, you know, so as I mentioned that, you know, Shah Waliullah was unable to fully escape from the Sufi and the more mystical inclinations, and you'll find that throughout the book. You know, idea of kashf. Kashf is where, so there's a dream, and so something appears to you in a dream. Kashf is where you're awake and something appears to you. So that's very, you know, problematic, because, you know, it's, as I mentioned, it's a blemish in otherwise brilliant work. A small blemish, not a huge one, because it doesn't add any value. You can't prove anything from that, because how many deviant people, their main source of proof is dreams. And, you know, and many people who are not so, who are from various groups, they took Shah Waliullah, this part of Shah Waliullah, they do the same thing. You know, I had a dream, you know, this whole culture of Peer and Murid in India and Pakistan is built upon this mystical experiences. Not built upon knowledge and verses and hadith so much, but it's built upon kashf and ilham and mystical experiences. So anyway, this is something very interesting. That's part of the introduction. And I'll share with you, actually, so Maulana Maududi writes in his Tajdeed, he has a very good analysis that I wanted to share just a few lines from. So he praises Shah Waliullah extensively in the work Hujjatullah, and then, you know, as his style is, he critiques some of the things at the end with respect. So he says the first deficiencies of the one. So he said that one of the deficiencies of what Shah Waliullah did, he said that he wasn't able to completely detach himself from the Muslim people's morbid attachment for tasawwuf. So he says, because he says, I have no personal grudge against the tasawwuf presented by these reformers. In spirit, it was indeed the real tasawwuf of Islam, nothing different from ihsan. But what I think should be carefully eschewed are the mystical allusions, the metaphorical references, the mystic language, and the continuance of this peculiar mystic lore, customs, and traditions. Why? Because this is part of superstition, and it develops this mystical superstitious culture. So Shah Waliullah was not like that. Everything presented was Quran and Hadith. But when he started using that language, so for some scholars at least, you know, that's a weakness, because now it gives ammunition to those people who are involved in all that superstition and folklore, and all of that come back. So anyway, so I'll leave the rest. Then after the vision, he says he wanted to write. So he wanted to write about the secrets of Sharia and so on and so forth, but he felt so much hesitation. There was a hindrance and a mental handicap for him, until he said there was a student, Muhammad Ashik of Pulat, was one of his students and disciples. So he came to him with his own dream. He says that, you know, I had this dream where I realized that the most important thing for human beings is sa'ada, this idea of human felicity. To understand really what sa'ada is, to understand really how to attain this idea. And that's really the purpose of all of deen and religion. And he came to Shah Waliullah and he said, and he saw some qualities in him and really encouraged him, he kept pushing him that, you know, you have to write, you know, don't, Shah Waliullah is making excuses that, you know, I'm not the right person and so on and so forth. But eventually by his encouragement, he actually took the step. And he writes that in the introduction, that this humble soul, his student, was the one who gave him the encouragement to actually start writing. So, and it's interesting, the whole Muqaddimah, you know, the idea is Sa'ada, and that's the chapter we're studying. It's chapter 5 of the book. It's just one of many, many chapters, but that's one of the central ideas of this book. So how human beings attain Sa'ada, or true happiness. And then the last thing he says, he ends by giving the title. So the title is Conclusive Argument, Hujjatullah al-Baligha. So he, you know, this comes from this verse. First of all, you need to see the verse. Allah says in Surah Al-An'am, قُلْ فَلِلَّهِ الْحُجَّةُ الْبَالِغَةُ وَلَوْ شَاءَ لَهَدَاكُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. After showing, the shirk and the mushrikeen and how their arguments are flimsy, Allah says to the Prophet, commanding him and us, قُلْ, say, فَلِلَّهِ الْحُجَّةُ الْبَالِغَةُ. With Allah is the far-reaching argument. With Allah is the conclusive, final argument. What Allah says is the final matter. وَلَوْ شَاءَ لَهَدَاكُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. Had He willed, He would have guided you all. But it's from His wisdom that He created this free will. So, for him, Shah Waliullah looks at this verse and he says, Hujjatullah al-Baligha means the secrets of the deen. Why Allah, legislated everything that He legislated. So he interpreted this verse in this way, which is not a wrong interpretation. And he says that this book that he wrote is a small branch that emanates from that. A branch emanating from this Allah's conclusive argument. And it's a new moon, a Badr al-Munir, rising upon the horizon. So this is now referring to his book. So actually, Hujjatullah al-Baligha refers to this verse, and he's hoping that this book is a tafsir or is a continuing commentary of this particular verse. That's a small branch from the light of this verse, Allah's conclusive grand argument. Okay, so the ending is slightly grandiose. By grandiose, I mean that's something you need to be aware. Like when you, the idea behind this seminar is to give you like tools to think and to help you understand some of the works that are written. A lot of these works, generally a lot of authors, sometimes they can come across as slightly grandiose, meaning with really huge visions that I'm the one who opened. Shah Waliullah is not so much like that, but occasionally it comes out. So at the end he's saying this is the grand argument and this book is unique. No one wrote a book like this, and this is a small branch from that. So that's just a style. Just think of that as a style of writing that many scholars are involved with. Some more than others. One of the greatest or the most guilty of that, one of the scholars is Allama Suyuti. Allama Suyuti, every other line is like that. So he turns to praising himself. Like for instance, like I said in the beginning, the Mujaddid, right? The Tajdeed. So there's a hadith that every 100 years Allah will send someone to revive the deen, Mujaddid. So Allama Suyuti, who died in 9/11, 900 years, about 900 years, yes, 900 years after the Prophet Hijrah, he writes, this book on Tajdeed, and he identifies every century who the Mujaddid is, and he's himself is a Shafi'i, follower of the Shafi'i school, so every Mujaddid is Shafi'i. So Imam Shafi'i, and then the next century, one of the Shafi'i scholars, and in his time he says, I am the Mujaddid of my time. So in his writing he comes across like that. So that's generally a style of writing that, you can argue with, but it is what it is. At the end of the day, Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. I'll open the floor. I think that's the end of the preface at least. Any questions, comments?
Did he study Imam Taymiyyah's books?
Yeah, so I mentioned in the biography last week. So Ibn Taymiyyah, he was impressed by him. Now he only spent 14 months in the Hijaz. So that's where he discovered hadith in a deeper way and the works of Ibn Taymiyyah. So he never got a chance to study Ibn Taymiyyah in detail, but he loved him. He came back, he even wrote a small book defending Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was not very popular in India, and you can even argue he's not so popular today. But he appreciated it. He wrote a small treatise defending him. But he didn't really study his works are, Ibn Taymiyyah is, you can say Shah Waliullah, but much exponentially magnified. So if you look at all the deficiencies of Shah Waliullah, the few that he has, Ibn Taymiyyah does not have them. So he's he lived a few hundred years earlier, but what he did, it's the same spirit. Shah Waliullah shares the same spirit of inquiry, the same way of looking at things in a broad way. But Ibn Taymiyyah, he had what the difference with him is, he had a brilliant memory. All his books were written from Asr to Zohar to Asr, and his command of hadith was extensive. Ibn Taymiyyah, in all the writings, he wrote much more than Shah Waliullah, much more volumes, and then and he quotes hadith from memory. There are very rare mistakes of hadith in Ibn Taymiyyah's writings. Shah Waliullah, in his books, a lot of times he'll quote a hadith that's not sound or is munkar. because he had a great respect for hadith. He discovered it and he had a good understanding, but he wasn't very deep in hadith. So he didn't have the chance to study in such detail. And also the mystical inclinations of Shah Waliullah are not there in Ibn Taymiyyah's work. So you can say it's a continuation of the same spirit and the same work. And he did appreciate him, but there was no exhaustive study, as you can see. There's there's a great seminar we're doing with our institute on Ibn Taymiyyah. So this is coming up October 29 and 30th. I know the leadership has a program in Maryland that weekend, but if you're here, this is a 2-day seminar presented by Dr. Yahya Misho of the Hartford Seminary. He's a Muslim professor. He speaks 11 languages. He's from Europe. He's written hundreds of works. He's the worldwide expert on Ibn Taymiyyah, a Western expert. So he spent his life studying Ibn Taymiyyah, writing about him. So we have the fortune of having him here. He's going to be in Why Islam. He's going to look at the work of Shah Waliullah. Very much like this, he's going to look at some of the things, not Shah Waliullah, Ibn Taymiyyah. So very much like he'll be looking at readings and analyzing his work and how he's been misunderstood today. So take advantage of that. There's some flyers here. That's coming up. Wallahu ta'ala.
You can register online, ICNA, NJ.
Anyone else?
As far as the language of the book is concerned, since you read like maybe Arabic books from Arabic scholars or the predecessors, how does it compare with the Indian person writing in Arabic?
Well, first of all, this book is written in Arabic. His Arabic is not Indian Arabic. That's number one, okay?
Yeah.
So it has no, and at that time, up until the British, before the British took over India, all the scholars were fluent in Farsi and Arabic at least, and their Arabic was very high. So Shah Waliullah's Arabic is very high. It's very eloquent, very few mistakes. There are other scholars that people can criticize their Arabic, and today anyone writes in Arabic, you can tell it's a non-Arab writing, but not Shah Waliullah. His Arabic is extremely eloquent, and it's hard to read. So books because he's a higher level, someone with a brilliant mind like that, and add to that he has eloquence in the language, is sometimes a little difficult to read. So I generally, most of the books I read are hadith, commentary. They're very simple and basic. But deep books like this that look at secrets of religion, very hard to read. So you really need dictionary for that. And you need to, not only dictionary, look at the style of his writing. It's very advanced level of writing. And it's pure Arabic. It's very, it was published in Arabic many, many times, republished. The best edition is the one by Sayyid Sabiq. So Sayyid Sabiq is the author of Fiqh al-Sunnah. He passed away many years ago, but he was a scholar of Azhar who authored that famous book, Fiqh al-Sunnah. So he's the one who did his edition of he has an introduction to that and he published it. And he praises that work immensely. So that's a very good edition. Also it's in Urdu, and the Urdu is a translation. It wasn't written in Urdu, but it's a translation. So Shah Waliullah wrote, like I said, most books in Arabic and a good chunk in Farsi. Those are the two languages he wrote on. And one of the brothers reminded me last week, and I read it also this week, his son translated the Quran into Urdu. So the first time the Quran was translated in any language ever in our history was Shah Waliullah into Persian, Farsi. And then the first time it was translated into Urdu was by his son. I forget his name, I think Abdul Qadir. Was it Abdul Qadir? So one of his sons. So this is pre-Urdu, so these works are written mostly in Arabic up until this time. Now after his son's time, now Urdu starts becoming the dominant language. Now most of the religious literature starts being written in Urdu until our times today. Okay, I think call it a night. It's been quite some time. Inshallah, we'll continue next week. Look at some features of the book and maybe start the chapter, or maybe just look at a few other things from this book. But now we're in the book already, so everything we're going to talk about is from this particular book. Inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك। ये तो लाजमी है, आपने हिदायत तो हासिल करनी है, तो आजकल तर्जुमा से ही काम
वही वो अलग उसी किताब थी।
इंशाअल्लाह।
अब किसने तर्जुमा किया मुझे याद नहीं है, बहुत बार
موٹی تھی
موٹی ہے وہ کم آگرہ پورا
کچھ ترجمے بہت یسیر ہوتے ہیں چھوٹے
نہیں
کچھ بہت
نہیں بہت ہے وہ آخر میں اس کے نا میرے خیال میں 30-35 صفحے ہیں نا وہ ترجمے ہیں تشریف کرنے کی ضرورت ہے وہ چیز تشریف بھی اس کی ہمیں یاد نہیں رہا کہ اس کے
دیکھتے ہیں آپ اگلے ہفتے تک مجھے بتانا
اب پتہ نہیں میں لوگوں نے سنا بیٹا میں کینیڈا جا رہا ہوں چھوٹا بیٹا ہے میرا ہی
اچھا ماشاء اللہ
باپ بیٹا کینیڈا میں ہوتا ہے اب ہم پتہ نہیں کہاں ہوتا ہے
آپ بھی ابھی آئے ہیں
مجھے 7 سال ہو گیا
7 سال
7
سال ہاں
پہلے جارجیا میں تھا لاسٹ ایئر ہے 15 میں جولائی میں یہاں پروجیکٹ لگا تھا تو آنا پڑا وہ بھی تو کینیڈا سے موو ہوا نا اپنا ڈاکٹر سا ہو گیا یاسین کو
ہاں ان کو وہ تو جرسی آئی ہو گیا
ہاں اچھا بہت کام کرتے ہیں وہ چلیے انشاءاللہ
چلیے
اللہ تعالیٰ ہمت دے
چلو